Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I am focusing specifically on cooking with chicken meat because that is something I do so often, probably at least once a week or a couple times a week. There is something that we're eating that contains chicken meat. So I will be sharing with you 3 different recipes that I think I rotate the most often. And it all starts with me cooking a whole chicken. I find this to be the easiest way to go about things rather than cutting up the chicken beforehand. So I just wash the whole chicken. I put some salt and some thyme and rosemary on it as well. And then I bake it in the oven as is. Oh, and I also cut it in half pretty much, or just the one side where you have the spine. So I cut it along the spine and then kind of split it up and lay it on the baking tray. This is just so that the meat cooks more evenly, or at least that's what I've been told or heard that is supposed to help. So I do that and I bake it in the oven, and then once it's done nice and golden, takes about an hour, I would say, hour and 15 minutes. I just pick all the meat off the bones. So I have a container for the meat, and then all the bones go into the pot where I will right away be making some chicken broth from those. That's why I like this method, because I can then use the nice crispy golden bones for the broth. And again, I have been told that it is better to use bones that have been cooked in the oven. Whether you bought the bones or you got the bones separately from the chicken, then you bake them in the oven, then you make broth, or you do it like I do, where you cook a whole chicken or bake a whole chicken and then use those bones for the broth. It's just supposed to taste better than if you were to make broth from raw bones. Now you can also probably see that I'm not very precise, or I don't, as I'm picking the meat off the bones, I'm just like really tearing pretty big chunks of the meat and putting all of those together. This is because you will see later, I actually cut up all this meat before using it. So at this stage, I don't care how big the chunks are. So it actually, as a result, it's pretty fast for me to pick all of this meat, usually like 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm done with it. And for the broth, I'm using one of my pre-made and frozen vegetable packages where I've got carrots, celery, and parsley. And those really do come in handy. I'm really glad that I thought of doing that. And one more thing to mention about baking that chicken, it really doesn't matter when you do this. Like I don't, to be honest, I don't remember when exactly I did this one. It was already like 2 weeks ago. But whenever I have time, that's when I do this. So even if it's in the morning and I already have something else for lunch, or like early afternoon, I just put it in the oven and do the whole process, make sure that I have time to pick the meat off the bones, and then just put the meat in the fridge or even in the freezer, and it's ready to go whenever I'm then making the meal, which here in these shots is later in the evening on that same day. But then I was using the meat on all different days. So this really is also why I like it, that I can just prepare the meat ahead of time whenever I have time and then just have it ready to be used. So what you saw me do here is wash some rice, which is going to be our side for this dish. And I also used some of the broth, which at this point has already been cooking for like, I think 2 or 3 hours, something like that. So some of it is ready, but then I added more water to it so that I would still have like a full pot of chicken broth on the stove. And then I got to prepare the chicken creamy sauce that we're having this dinner. It started with cutting up some onion and browning that, which I feel like is 80% of the time when I'm cooking, I'm starting with cutting up onions and browning them. So, not reinventing the wheel here. This is just something that works. So I'm browning the onion in lard. I'm getting the chicken ready from the fridge and also a few other things. Once the onion is browned, I'm adding the chicken, which doesn't really need to cook. I mean, it's already cooked, but just browning it slightly as well. And then I'm pouring in my cream. And once that comes to a boil and thickens up, which I'm not sure if all creams would do that, but I am using like a 31% fat. So maybe that's why it thickens up so nicely. So once it is a little bit more thick, I'm adding sun-dried tomatoes and then the spinach. And that's pretty much it. I believe I have also salted it at some point. You could add garlic as well. That would go well into this. I think I just forgot about it this time, so that was missing. But even then, this still turned out to be really delicious. And this is something that we all really, really enjoy. All right, the next one is very, very similar to it, but it's even more simpler. Again, starting with browning the onion. And I just wanted to mention as well, as I'm cutting it up and browning it, that both of these sauces, what I really like about them is that all the ingredients that I'm using are really long lasting, and I can always make sure that I have them in stock, whether it's in my fridge or in the freezer. The first one, it was the sun-dried tomatoes, the spinach I have in the freezer. The cream actually also lasts really, really long in the fridge, so I always have plenty of those. The only thing that I need to make sure I have is the chicken meat, which is something I buy, I guess, the most frequently out of all of these. So in this second sauce, like I said, it's very similar with the onion. Then I'm cutting up all the meat and adding that to it. And what's different here, I also have the cream, so that's the same. And what's different is after the cream, I add in cheddar cheese. So there is no tomatoes or spinach. This one is super simple with just the cheese in it, but it's just as delicious. And as a side for this one, I could do the rice. I think that works really well, and I have done that in the past, but just to change things up a little bit, I'm doing some pasta. And again, just a very delicious, I would say crowd-pleasing meal. I think a lot of people would enjoy this kind of combination. And the last way I use chicken meat in my kitchen the most often is in soups. I make these so often now that I've gotten into the habit of making broth, because before, broth was always the thing where I was like, oh man, I just don't have that on hand. And I didn't really like the, like the bouillon cubes or, fake broth, let's call it that. Now these ones with the real broth, they're something else. That's a different game. And so the typical kind of soup that I make is chicken broth, chicken meat, and some vegetables. Usually, or pretty much always, carrots in there. And this time I'm adding some parsley as well, but I could do celery. I could do, whether it's the green part of celery or actually like the bulb celery. And I'm sure there are other vegetables as well that could be added into it. But these are the ones I usually have on hand. So I'm cutting them up. I didn't on this day have the onion. I didn't have a fresh one. I only had red onions, which I felt like wouldn't go that well into the soup. But what I did have is these frozen, pre-cut onions and bacon. We always use that mix for scrambled eggs in the morning. That's why I have them in stock in the freezer. But I felt like the bacon is going to fit very well into this soup, so I use that in the beginning. So first having that heat up and then adding all the vegetables into it, browning those a little bit as well, and then adding all of the chicken broth. I would add other things into the soup depending on how I intend to use it. So if I really want the soup as like a main course and that's the only thing we're eating, then I would maybe also add just something to thicken it up. So like maybe oats or maybe some other, like croutons or, just something else to make it a little bit more filling, or serve it with bread or even like a grilled cheese or something like that. But today we also had another main course, so I just kept the soup very simple with just the broth, the vegetables, and the meat. And that is it. Those were my 3 favorite ways to use chicken meat. I hope you found some inspiration in there, and I will see you next week. Bye.